Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Romberg. I'm a managing partner with MetricNet, and I will be your host for today's webcast on service desk and desktop collaboration. I want to welcome all of you and thank you for participating in our webcast today. Before we get started, I have just a few administrative announcements to make. During the presentation, all of you will be in listen-only mode. However, if you have any questions during the webcast, you can type them in the dialog box that appears in the lower right corner of your screen, and I'll pause once during the presentation to answer questions. Additionally, I'll remain on the webcast at the conclusion of the presentation to answer any final questions that you might have or that I did not get to during the first Q&A break. This webcast is a bit shorter than most. It goes about an hour and 15 minutes. So for those of you who have other commitments later in the day, I should be wrapped up by about 3:15 or so Eastern Time. I would encourage all of you to connect with MetricNet on social media. We're active on all of the major social media sites. We put out a steady stream of posts and tweets, articles, discussions, and presentations that are designed to enrich the community of IT service and support professionals and provide you with tools, insights, and information that you can use to enhance your professional careers. And for those who are attending the HDI Conference in Las Vegas next week, I want to make you aware of two presentations that MetricNet will be delivering at the conference. HDI has designated MetricNet for the opening presentation of the conference immediately following the keynote speech by Steve Wozniak, the co-founder of Apple. This is session 101 and will address the economic impact of support and how you can create a value proposition for your support organization. Second presentation is all about key performance indicators for desktop support and how you can use desktop support KPIs diagnostically and holistically. Please look us up if you're at the conference, and if you're interested, we'd love to have you attend our presentations. One final note, and this is particularly important for those of you who wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. When you exit the webcast, a brief survey will pop up on your screen. Please be aware that only those who complete the survey will receive a copy of the presentation. This survey provides us with valuable feedback on the webcast. It's only 3 questions long, and it takes less than 10 seconds to complete. So if you do us a favor and answer that survey at the end of the webcast, I'd be very grateful. And in return for that courtesy, I'll send you a copy of today's presentation. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. As many of you know, MetricNet's core business is benchmarking. Over the years, we have completed, I should say, hundreds of benchmarks for service desks and desktop support groups worldwide. One of the advantages of doing that many benchmarks is that we have built up the most comprehensive database of IT service and support metrics in the industry. This data gives us a lot of insight into the key success factors of the industry's top-performing support organizations. So it's worth pointing out right up front that everything you see and hear in today's webcast is empirical in nature. There's nothing hypothetical, academic, or theoretical about what I'm going to be presenting today. It is simply based on what we have observed in the industry, having completed literally thousands of IT service and support benchmarks. Now, to set the stage for our discussion on collaboration, what I'd like to do is quickly review what some of the performance indicators for both the service desk and desktop support are telling us about how service and support have evolved over the last 25 years. On this page, we're looking at service desk indicators, and we're reaching all the way back to 1988. And we're looking at some of the metrics that help us understand how this support function has evolved in the last 25 years. In 1988, the average service desk end user placed about 0.79 contacts to the service desk per month. So on average, if you take all of your end users, divide it by the number of contacts, or vice versa, I should say, divide the number of contacts by the number of end users, you've got almost 1 contact per end user per month, or 0.79 contacts per end user per month. Last year, that number was nearly 2. It was double what it was in 1988, and this is a reflection of the fact that the average knowledge worker has a whole lot more computing power on their desk than they had in 1988. They've got more applications, they've got more systems, they've got more devices. That creates greater complexity and the need for more support. Back in 1988, the cost per contact was under $10. This is the total cost of all the service desk personnel, including both the agents, the frontline agents, as well as the indirect personnel, plus the facilities cost, the telecom cost, the technology expense, the travel, the training, the office supplies. Take all of the expense, divide it by all of the inbound contacts, and it was about $10 a contact in 1988. Last year, that number was around $22. The reason is that the handle times have increased dramatically, and they've increased dramatically because the complexity has increased. Handle times have gone from about 6.5 minutes in 1988 to nearly 13 minutes last year. Now, if we look at the percentage of inbound contacts that were resolved on the initial contact, FCR, first contact resolution rate, in 1988 the number was only 35%. Last year, that number had grown to nearly 70%. That's a very positive trend, and it's a reflection of the fact that most support organizations now recognize that at level 1, first contact resolution rate is the single biggest driver of customer satisfaction. This is an important concept. Back in 1988, that was not well understood, and most level 1 support organizations, most service desks, were really bag and tag or log and dispatch. They were message-taking services. They would take a call, and if it was something relatively simple, like a password reset or a printer reset, they'd handle it. But everything else got dispatched or escalated to another source of support. So this is a very positive development, the recognition that FCR drives customer satisfaction at level 1. Now, if we look at the number of tickets resolved at level 1, this is a different metric than first contact resolution rate. This is known as FLR, or first level resolution rate. So back in 1988, nearly 40% were resolved at level 1. That's compared to 35% resolved on first contact. So these are not necessarily resolved on first contact, but they're resolved at level 1, 39%. That number has grown to 74%. And again, this is a very positive development. It reflects the fact that most IT service and support professionals now recognize that getting it done at level 1 is not just a catchphrase. It really does help drive value in the organization, because the more tickets you resolve at level 1, the lower will be your total cost of ownership for IT service and support. And I'll show you data on that as we get further into our presentation today. So again, a very positive development here. We also see that adjusted for inflation, that is in constant dollars, that salaries have gone up. Back in 1988, if we look at it in current dollars, the starting salary for a typical level 1 agent was about $27,000 a year. Last year, that number had grown to about $35,000. Now, this isn't because IT or service desks are becoming more benevolent. It is, again, a reflection of some very important realities. The fact is, when you're willing to pay a little bit more for a starting agent, you get a more qualified, better experienced, more educated agent. They are then able to drive a higher first contact resolution rate and a higher first level resolution rate. And even though you're paying those agents a little bit more, comparatively speaking, it helps drive your total cost of support down, because you are getting a higher first level resolution rate as a result of getting a more quality agent in at level 1. In 1988, on average, it cost about $100 to support an end user over the course of a year. That is, you look at the number of contacts that were placed over the course of a year, look at the total cost of the service desk divided by the total number of end users, and you're looking at about $100 per end user per year. Last year, that number had grown to about $500. And again, this is reflective of the fact that there are more tickets, the tickets are costlier, and the environment is simply more complex than it was. So what we have here is a very interesting story about how level 1 support has evolved over the last 25 years. And the fact that most service and support managers and most IT managers outside of service and support recognize the importance of FCR in driving customer satisfaction, and recognize the importance of level 1 resolution, or FLR, first level resolution rate, in helping to minimize the total cost of ownership. Now let's take a look at some desktop support metrics, again reaching back 25 years, looking at a whole set of KPIs that we believe tell an interesting story about how this industry has evolved over the last quarter century. The number of tickets per seat per month in 1988 was about 0.5 or 0.53. Last year, that number had grown to about 0.8. And once again, it's a story of complexity. Your average knowledge worker now has more than 3 devices. They might have a laptop computer, they might have a smartphone, they might have a desktop computer, they might have a printer. The average knowledge worker has more than 3 devices. Those require support, and those require more contacts to both level 1 support and visits by desktop support. The cost per ticket in 1988 was about $29. That number has grown to $62. Compare that to the level 1 support, where last year the cost per ticket was about $22. The average incident work time, we make a distinction between incidents and work requests, but an incident in 1988 required about almost 18 minutes to resolve. Last year, the number was about 32 minutes. Again, greater complexity in the environment. Now, this is an interesting statistic. The number of incidents resolved on first contact by desktop support in 1988 was about 74%. Last year, it was lower than that. It was 68%. Question is why, and the reason is because desktop support is supporting a more complex set of tickets. And specifically, if you look at the percentage of tickets resolved at level 1, or I should say percent resolved level 1 capable, remember this metric, it's going to come up several times in today's discussion. This is the percentage of tickets resolved by desktop support that could and should have been resolved at level 1. More than half the tickets they were working on and resolving in 1988 could and should have been done at level 1. And this is, again, reflective of this metric here. Level 1 was only resolving about 40% of all incoming tickets, and so 54% of the tickets resolved by desktop support could and should have been resolved at level 1. By last year, that number was down to 19%. Very, very positive development, recognition, again, of the fact that getting it done at level 1 is a good thing. If a ticket can be resolved at level 1, it should be resolved at level 1. You should not be pushing it to desktop support. You should not be dispatching a desktop support technician if the ticket can be resolved at level 1. And because there are fewer, quote-unquote, level 1 tickets being resolved by desktop support, the number of incidents resolved on first contact is lower because the complexity is higher. There are fewer of the, I'll call them gimmies, if you will, where the desktop support technician goes out to the side of the user and is a relatively straightforward issue to resolve that could and should have been resolved at level 1. So we see that the percent resolved level 1 capable metric is moving in the right direction. Specifically, it's gone from more than half of all tickets to under 20% of all tickets. And again, we have the same phenomenon with starting technician salaries. Back in 1988, about $37,000 across North America. This is a broad swatch, a large average, and these numbers do vary dramatically. The number is up to about $44,000 now. Depending upon where you are in the United States, this number can be as high as $60,000 or as low as about $29,000. It really depends upon local geography, labor availability, cost of living in the local area. So this number varies pretty dramatically, but the conclusion is still the same, which is that starting technician salaries have gone up over the last 25 years, again reflecting the fact that when you're willing to pay a little bit more for a starting technician, you get a more qualified, better educated, more experienced technician, and that helps you drive higher first contact incident resolution rates and helps you minimize the number of tickets resolved by desktop support that could and should have been resolved at level 1. Finally, if we look at the cost of supporting an end user, back in 1988, it was about $184 a year. Last year, the number was up to about $580. So why collaborate? The subject of today's webcast. Well, it sounds good and everyone says they want to do it, but there are barriers to making it happen. You're probably familiar with some of them. If you have different managers over the service desk and desktop support, that in and of itself represents a barrier. If service and support get their funding from different sources, i.e. the service desk gets funding from one pot of money and desktop support gets their funding from a different source, that can represent a barrier. You have things that are what we call drive-bys, flybys, and snags. This is a situation where a desktop support technician is walking along and gets snagged or grabbed by someone who says, hey, can you help me out here? I've got an issue that needs to be addressed. I've got to turn these rows into columns in Excel, or I've got to archive these old Outlook items, or I need to sync my BlackBerry to my computer. These types of drive-bys, flybys, and snags, as much as it would be nice for end users to be able to have that luxury, they cost money, and they violate the SPOC principle, single point of contact. And we're going to be talking also about SPOC throughout today's presentation, because single point of contact is one of the keys to collaboration, and it's one of the keys to improving the quality of service delivered by IT service and support, and one of the keys to driving down the total cost of ownership in IT service and support. Other barriers are when you don't have shared goals and incentives between level 1 and desktop support. Poor training, weak management, and lack of discipline in following a SPOC process. And in many organizations, sadly, unfortunately, support is simply a low priority, and so there's not a lot of motivation, not a lot of incentive to look at collaboration and engage in some of the effort that's required to collaborate more effectively. But there are significant benefits. It's not all barriers, it's not all drawbacks, it's not all cost in getting to a more collaborative environment. Specifically, you can realize lower support costs, greater customer satisfaction for IT support, shorter cycle times on resolution, enhanced user productivity, and greater customer satisfaction, not just for support, but for all of IT. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. This is not just motherhood and apple pie. There is real, tangible proof that collaboration pays off in a number of ways, and I'm about to go through 4 case studies from organizations that made a specific decision to intentionally collaborate more effectively and create a seamless end-to-end support operation. And I'll show you evidence, I'll show you data on the money they saved and the improvements that they realized in customer satisfaction as measured by customer service and support. So what we're going to do today to demonstrate the benefits of collaboration and present some real-world data on how you can make collaboration a reality in your support environment is to go through 4 separate case studies from IT service and support organizations that made a decision to overcome the barriers that I just mentioned and build a more collaborative support organization. Our first case study comes from the freight industry, and specifically we're talking here about an international freight company that moved everything from letter-sized packages to huge containers. In this particular organization, many of the users would simply call desktop support directly when they had an issue because they had learned over time that if they called desktop support directly, a technician would come running and they'd come to their office, their place of work, and they would fix the problem. So this is called bypass. That is, you're bypassing the SPOC process. You're not going in through level 1 and you're contacting desktop support directly. Now, there are situations where this does make sense, and I'll explain later in the presentation when it makes sense to contact desktop support directly. However, in the vast majority of circumstances, contacts, incidents, and service requests should be going through the level 1 support organization. In this freight company, desktop support technicians were providing on-the-spot assistance. So these drive-bys, snags, flybys, as I mentioned a few moments ago, were pervasive. The service desk didn't have any real clear dispatch rules for desktop support. When they got busy, they pushed tickets to desktop support. When they weren't as busy, they hung on to tickets, probably in some cases longer than they should have. There weren't any operating level agreements. This is essentially an internal contract between the service desk and desktop support that is designed to help them work as a seamless IT service and support organization, engaging in effective handoffs of tickets and supporting each other in the resolution to minimize cycle time in resolving these tickets. Lost tickets were common, and unfortunately, customer satisfaction was low for service and support overall. It was low for both the service desk, and it was low for desktop support. Now, to explain what this organization did, it's helpful to understand some of the economics of total cost of ownership. When it comes to IT service and support, the lowest cost source of support is actually level -1, which means prevention, which essentially says the user never has the problem to begin with. It's been eliminated through root cause analysis or through training or through intelligent design, so they just don't have the problem. And again, that's called level -1. You can get there through root cause analysis or closed case analysis. Then you've got level 0 support, which is user self-service, self-help. For example, user-enabled password resets represent level 0. But then when you get personnel involved in resolving these tickets and these service requests, you have level 1 support, the service desk, which last year, as I mentioned in the statistics that we just reviewed, the average cost per ticket was about $22. That's a fully loaded cost per ticket. Level 2, which we call desktop support, your vernacular might be a little bit different, but the cost of resolving at desktop support last year in North America was about $62. If the ticket got pushed out to what we call level 3, like an application group, a NOC, a networking group, and so on, the cost was about $85. Field support, almost $200 per ticket, and when a vendor's involved, you're looking at almost $500 per ticket. Moreover, these costs are additive, they're not cumulative, and what that means is that if a ticket starts at level 1 and gets transferred or dispatched to level 2 desktop support, you have an additional $62 on top of the initial $62. If you dispatch a ticket to level 3 after it goes through level 1, you're talking about an additional $85 on top of that initial $22 and so on. So these are additive costs. And it's important to understand this. when we talk about getting it done at level 1, once again, it's not just a catchphrase. It really does help drive down total cost of support. And anytime you're taking a ticket that could and should have been resolved at level 1 and you're pushing it to desktop support or level 3 or field support or vendor, when it could have been resolved at level 1, you are incurring significant additional costs that can and should be avoided. Now, the key to maximizing the level 1 resolution rate and hence minimizing your TCO for support is to have a SPOC, a single point of contact support organization. So in the diagram here, you've got a user community, you've got a level 1 service desk. This is your entry point for the single point of contact IT support. And then you've got points of dispatch, desktop support, field support, level 2 IT support, and vendor support. Some of the key principles in ensuring that SPOC is working effectively, your single point of contact process, is that the enterprise has got to take an end-to-end view of user, service, and support. The user has to have a single point of contact for all IT-related issues and service requests. And that single point of contact is, in fact, the level 1 service desk. This doesn't mean that the service desk is expected to solve everything that comes in, not by any stretch of the imagination, but somebody's got to have ownership. Somebody's got to play traffic cop. Somebody has to triage these tickets that come in. And that source, that single point of contact, is the level 1 service desk. Now, the service desk and desktop support need to have the same service level agreement with the customers so that they're operating in sync with each other and have a common set of incentives. The service desk and desktop support need to have an internal agreement between themselves so that they can operate effectively. Now, as I mentioned, level 1's not responsible for resolving everything, but they are responsible for ticket triage, resolution at level 1 if possible, effective handoffs to what we call N-level support, which is anything above level 1 support. They're responsible for resolution, coordination, and facilitation. This doesn't necessarily mean ownership. In some organizations, level 1 owns the ticket from beginning to end. In other organizations, ownership transfers as the ticket gets escalated or transferred. So if a ticket goes to desktop support, desktop then owns it. If it goes to field services, they then own it. I'm indifferent about who owns the ticket. The main thing is that there need to be clear rules of ownership. It needs to be understood who owns the ticket. But level 1, regardless of who owns the ticket, level 1 needs to maintain some control over that and is responsible, should be responsible for resolution, coordination, and facilitation. And ultimately, ticket closure can take place either at level 1 or N level. But again, the rules need to be extremely clear about who owns the ticket and who closes the ticket. So desktop drive-bys, flybys, and snags don't work in a SPOC environment. And if your environment, if your users have gotten used to grabbing a desktop support technician and asking that person for help anytime they need it, and they become dependent upon those local technicians, it's very difficult to wean them off that. I understand that. If you go to a strict SPOC model and suddenly the guy in the corner office can't grab his or her favorite technician and have them help him or her out whenever they need that assistance, then they're going to be understandably miffed, at least for a short period of time. It's not unusual when you adopt a SPOC model to see a temporary reduction in customer satisfaction as the end users get used to the new model. But in the long run, it's a better model that produces higher levels of customer satisfaction, quicker resolution times, and lower total cost of ownership. Now, I introduced a metric very early on called percent resolved level 1 capable. Not that many support organizations track it. It's a metric that is specifically tracked at desktop support. If you're not yet tracking it, I want to encourage you to start tracking it. You can put a checkbox on the trouble ticket that when a ticket is closed by desktop support or desktop services, they check the box if they believe that ticket could and should have been resolved at level 1. But the data that we have for percent resolved level 1 capable shows that on average, this number is higher in an organization that does not have single point of contact support than it is in an organization that does have single point of contact support. So the blue diamonds here represent data from IT services support organizations that follow a SPOC process, and the average number of tickets resolved by desktop support that could and should have been resolved at level 1 is 15.3%. By contrast, for those IT services support organizations that don't have a single point of contact support organization, these are the fuchsia-colored squares here, the average percent of tickets resolved by desktop support that could and should have been resolved at level 1 is about 23%. So SPOC support reduces your total cost of ownership, and it's very difficult to get to a reasonable, let alone a competitive total cost of ownership for support unless you are tracking this metric and taking specific steps and actions that will allow desktop support to minimize and reduce the percentage of tickets they resolve that are level 1 capable. So what happened in this freight company, this organization, was that they implemented a SPOC IT service and support process. We were able to measure them, benchmark them, before they implemented SPOC and again 10 months later. If we look at the number of tickets that originated at level 1, meaning that they enter the process right here at the level 1 service desk, 64% of tickets entered level 1 or originated at level 1 before SPOC. 10 months later, they were up to almost 87% of all tickets originating at level 1. The percent resolved level 1 capable was almost 40% before they had the SPOC model. It was 14% 10 months later. That's a good thing, as evidenced by this chart here. And go back to our economics chart, the more tickets you can push from desktop support to level 1, the better. Your cost of support will go down. If we look at customer satisfaction, that number went from 66% to almost 80%. Still not a great number, but a whole lot better than 66%. And the average weighted cost per ticket went from $73 down to $45. This average weighted cost is you take the total cost of desktop support, total cost of level 1 support, divide it by all tickets. It was $73 before they started the SPOC support process. 10 months later, they were down to $45. This is real data supporting the idea of collaboration through single point of contact, having a common set of rules, and making sure that level 1 is responsible for ticket triage, resolution at level 1 if possible, effective handoffs to end-level support, resolution coordination and facilitation, and ticket closure. And that brings us to our first polling question of the day. That polling question, as you can imagine, has to do with SPOC, and specifically, the question is this: do you run a SPOC, single point of contact support organization? To give you a little bit of a preview here, when we started doing this particular webcast a number of years ago, the number of IT service and support organizations that were single point of contact was under 30%. Okay, I'd like as many of you as possible to weigh in on this. It looks like we've got about 80% participation right now. I want to give you just another few seconds to weigh in on this. Let us know whether or not you run a single point of contact support organization. You got yes, no, or for those of you who are not affiliated with a support organization, consultants and so on, not applicable would be the right answer. Okay, we've got almost 95% participation. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and close that poll and then share the results with you. This is interesting. About 70% are running a single point of contact IT service and support organization. Another 25% are not, and then 6% not applicable. So this is significantly better, and it continues to improve every time we deliver this webcast. The number goes up a little bit more. Significantly better than it was when we first started doing this webcast a number of years ago. For those of you who don't have a SPOC, single point of contact support organization, in a few rare cases, it makes sense not to have a single point of contact support organization, but in the vast majority of cases, SPOC, that is single point of contact for IT services support, is the right approach. So I'll talk about that in more detail as we get further into our presentation, but for now, 70% of you are following a SPOC process, 25% of you are not following a single point of contact IT service and support process. So we're going to move on now to our second case study on IT service and support collaboration. And here's the scenario. At a regional bank in the Northeast, support costs are high. IT service and support costs are high. We know this from benchmarking. There were situations when desktop support was short-staffed and situations when the service desk was short-staffed. Escalation defects would increase when the service desk was busy. And what do I mean by escalation defects? I'm talking about pushing tickets from level 1 to desktop support just because you're busy. Not because you can't resolve them, but because you got too many tickets in queue, so you push them out to level 2. So these escalation defects were pretty common, particularly when the service desk got busy, which was pretty often. They appeared to be short-staffed. Service levels were rarely met, and the customer satisfaction was low. Now what this organization decided to do is cross-train some of their technicians so that they could work in both the service desk and desktop support. Now this is not a panacea. It's not a universal solution. There are a few circumstances under which this cross-training does make sense, and I'll show you in a moment what that is. But when we started this project, they had 12 full-time people working in the service desk, 7 full-time people working in desktop support, for a total of 19 working in IT service and support. Over several months, they cross-trained 4 individuals to work both service desk and desktop support. Now, one thing I want to point out is that a good desktop support technician doesn't always translate into a good service desk technician, and vice versa. The skill sets are very different. You know that if you've worked in service and support. Being great at level 1 doesn't mean you're going to be a good desktop tech, and being a great desktop tech doesn't mean you're going to be good at level 1. So you have to be careful about who you select for cross-training, because if you're not careful, you're not going to hit this sweet spot, that is the overlap where you find those 20% of service desk techs that actually work out well as desktop techs and vice versa. So you got to be careful when you do this cross-training to select the right individuals, those that do have the aptitude, the talent, the ability, and the enthusiasm to do well as both a level 1 agent and a desktop support technician. Now, the success factors for cross-training the agents are these. You have to be co-located with the users. That's pretty obvious. If you're in a remote location, tens or even hundreds of miles away, you can't do desktop support. So you've got to be co-located with the users. IT service and support has got to be either in the same building or in the same campus as the users. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to do this cross-training. The second success factor is that the users need to be in a high-density environment. This means that they're in a high-rise building or a campus-type setting. The reason for this is that it facilitates what we call jump and go. And what that means is that you'll have a service desk technician that is trying to troubleshoot a problem with the user. They can't get it done. They realize they've got to go out there to the side of the user, so they jump and go. They transition, they put on their cape, they leave the service desk, and they go out there and they do desktop support work. So you've got to be in a high-density user environment for this to work. Thirdly, it tends to work best when your scale is relatively low. Typically, if you have more than 20 support techs between the service desk and desktop support, it makes sense to have separate functions because you get better scale economies that way. But when you're on the small side, if you have fewer than 20 total support techs in desktop and the service desk, it sometimes does make sense to cross-train some of those to do both level 1 service desk work and desktop support work. And as I mentioned, not all technicians can or should be cross-trained. Now here's what happened. Before they did this, they of course didn't have any cross-trained agents or technicians. 6 months into this, they had cross-trained 4 of their agents. Keep in mind their head count's pretty low. Started at 19, but the head count, they were able to drop their head count by 2 FTEs by cross-training these 4 individuals. They got better utilization out of their technicians and their agents by cross-training. Customer satisfaction went from 72% to 85%. The weighted average cost per ticket went from $67 down to $55, largely because they dropped headcount. And this metric, which keeps coming up, percent resolved level 1 capable, a desktop support metric, went from 25% down to 9%. That is success. So they had cross-trained 4 agents. They became universal agents, providing support both at level 1 and for desktop support, and they got a good result out of it. Better customer satisfaction, lower cost, lower headcount, and a lower percentage of tickets resolved that are level 1 capable. And that brings us to our second polling question of the day. And that second polling question is this. Does your support organization have agents or technicians that are cross-trained for both level 1 and desktop support? Does your support organization have agents that are cross-trained for both level 1 and desktop support? Keep in mind that it doesn't always make sense to do this. So there's no right or wrong answer here, but there are some success factors, those that I just went through. High density user environment, relatively low scale. Okay, almost 80% of you have voted on this. I'd ask you to weigh in on this poll if you haven't yet voted. Does your support organization have agents that are cross-trained for both level 1 and desktop support? Okay, I'm going to close that poll down and share the results with you. Here's those results. 44% of you, that's a large number. Normally the number is about 20 to 25%. So 44% of you have agents or technicians that are cross-trained for both level 1 and desktop support. 48% of you no. Almost an even split. That's much closer than it normally is. Generally, as I mentioned, the number who have cross-trained agents are in the range of 20 to 25%. So very interesting result. I'm going to go ahead and close down that poll, and I'm going to take a few questions at this point. So if you have a question, please type it in the dialog box that appears in the lower right corner of your screen, and I'll answer that question for you. Okay, the first question here is coming from Kevin, and the question is this. On slide 5, I talked about FLE, I think you mean FLR, first level and first contact resolution. The metrics you gave were 67% first contact and 74% first level. Are these metrics, let's see, I don't see the whole question here. Let's see, are these metrics, one, based on in scope, out of scope? I'm trying to read your question, Kevin, it's not showing up here. Let me see if I can open my window up a little bit here. Okay. Are these metrics, one, based on in-scope, out-of-scope tickets or all contacts, and two, exclusive or inclusive of non-phone contacts? Okay, so they are based upon, first of all, let me talk about in-scope versus out-of-scope. Creating an artificial definition of what's in-scope and out-of-scope for level 1 or desktop support, in my opinion, makes no sense at all. What should be in scope in level 1 is anything that can be resolved at level 1, and what's in scope at desktop support would be anything that cannot be resolved at level 1 and doesn't need to be escalated to other levels, say level 3 support and so on. So the idea of creating an artificial barrier about what's in scope, what's out of scope doesn't make any sense to me. However, what I think you might be getting at is what I call net first contact resolution rate and net first level resolution rate, which means that when you calculate FCR, you take all contacts resolved on first contact divided by all contacts that could potentially be resolved on first contact. Not everything can potentially be resolved on first contact. That's what we call net FCR. Likewise, for first level resolution rate, net FLR is everything resolved at level 1 divided by everything that can potentially be resolved at level 1. So if you've got a hardware break fix that comes in at level 1, you can't resolve that at level 1. You push it out to desktop support or some other source of support. That doesn't count against you. It doesn't go in the denominator. So if that's what you're driving at, Kevin, we look at net FCR and net FLR, meaning that what's in the denominator should be only those things that can be resolved at level 1 or can be resolved on first contact. Now, here's a question from Nalia. I've seen tickets per seat and tickets per analyst used often. Is there a difference in per seat and per person? Well, the tickets per seat is often used as sort of a synonym, if you will, for tickets per person. They're not quite the same thing because oftentimes you have devices that are not associated with a seat. But generally, those two metrics are pretty comparable. If you take the total number of tickets divided by the total number of seats that you have in the user environment, and you take the total number of tickets you have divided by the total number of end users supported, the numbers are usually pretty close. Now, if you're talking about tickets per analyst in the service desk or desktop support versus tickets per seat in service desk or desktop support, the numbers can be different if you've got what's called hoteling. In other words, if for a given seat in support, you've got different people sitting in that seat at different shifts, that number will differ pretty dramatically. So in an environment where you're sharing workspaces, doing hoteling, for example, tickets per seat and tickets per analyst are going to look very, very different. So you need to recognize that. But that's only in an environment where you're sharing workspace, doing hoteling, for example. Okay. From Burke. More than half the desktop support folks in our organization come from the service desk. Okay, well, I'm not sure if that means they were promoted from the service desk or if they're cross-trained. So if you want to clarify that, Burke, that would be great. Okay. From Andre, you said that when percent resolved on level 1 is decreasing, it is a success. Maybe I misspoke, but the percent resolved at level 1 increasing is a success. not decreasing. So maybe I misspoke, and I apologize for that. But yes, the more you resolve at level 1, the better. So if that number is decreasing, that's not good. If the number is going up, that is good. Okay, from Andrea, separation of duties is a barrier for cross-training. How can that be managed? Well, I'm not sure what you mean by separation of duties. If you've got a bargaining unit or a union that says that certain duties can only be done by certain people, that's a bargaining unit issue. It's a contractual issue, and it needs to be dealt with over time. But if you've got an arbitrary separation of duties between the level 1 service desk and desktop support, that should not be a barrier, in my opinion, to cross-training. Common sense should prevail here, and you should recognize, in some cases, those high-density environments where you're, co-located with the users and you're relatively small scale. This separation of duties thing doesn't make any sense. So again, if there's a contractual issue, you've got to be cognizant of that, particularly if it's a union issue. But if there's not a contractual issue that forces a separation of duties, then all I can say is your organization needs to get over it, and they need to recognize that for the greater good, i.e. minimizing total cost of ownership and driving a higher first contact, first level resolution rate, you need to look at the possibility of cross-training some of your agents. Okay, there are other questions in queue, and I would like to answer those, but I want to move on in our presentation now to make sure that I finish on time. Any remaining questions that you type in between now and the end of the webcast, and any questions that are in queue right now, I will address at the conclusion of the webcast. But for right now, I need to move on in our presentation. Our third case study, it comes from a multinational insurance company, and the scenario is this. Both support groups, meaning service desk and desktop support, looked like they were performing pretty well. Their costs were in line with industry averages. The customer satisfaction was above average. They were following a SPOC process. So the question is, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is it's very possible, looking independently at the service desk, to conclude, wow, this is a good service desk. And looking independently at desktop support and concluding the same thing. This is a good desktop support organization. But when you look at the entirety of service and support, it's very possible that the conclusion would be different, that service and support is not performing as well as it could or should. This is a classic sub-optimization, and we find it a lot in this industry, where the service desk by itself appears to be performing well, the desktop support by itself appears to be performing well, but because they're siloed and because the organization is not taking an end-to-end view of support, and because there are not efficient handoffs and interactions between level 1 and desktop support, they incur higher costs. They realize lower customer satisfaction as a result of that. And so what this organization decided to do was benchmark. Now, they had an incentive pay system whereby half of the bonus was based upon individual performance and half was based on the results of an annual service and support benchmark. Now, the agents and technicians in service and support had been getting only about 40% of the bonus each year because they were not performing well on the service and support benchmark. Now, very briefly, benchmarking, for those of you, most of you probably know what it is. Some of you have even gone through this process before. But what you do is you compare your support performance to the performance of a peer group, of a group of selected IT service and support organizations that are comparable to yours in scope and scale and complexity and geography. If you want to read more on this, we do have a white paper free on our website that you can download. Now, the comparison in benchmarking by itself is not that valuable. It's interesting, but by itself it isn't that valuable. What you really need to do is look at those performance gaps, whether they're in cost or quality or percent resolved level 1 capable or first contact or first level resolution rate, and ask yourself, in those situations where there are support organizations performing better than yours, you have to ask why. How are they getting to that better level of support? Because if you understand that, you can selectively adopt and adapt what they're doing and achieve the same result. And that's the real beauty of benchmarking, is that you don't have to improve incrementally through trial and error with all the blood, sweat, and tears associated with that. The industry best practices for IT service and support are pretty well documented now. For those of you who attend our webcasts regularly, we talk about the key success factors for IT service and support. And these best practices, as I mentioned, are relatively well documented. So you can bypass all the blood, sweat, and tears, all the trial and error, all the incrementalism associated with this kind of improvement, and improve your performance not at an evolutionary pace, but at a revolutionary pace. That's the real beauty of benchmarking, is that it enables you to not reinvent the wheel, but rather become world-class in a relatively short period of time by building upon the industry's proven best practices. Now, in order to go through this case study, I'm going to do a real quick primer on IT service and support key performance indicators. And what I'm showing on page 23 are the 25 most common service desk metrics. These are not all-inclusive. There are literally hundreds of service desk KPIs. But what we've done on this page is we've broken up these 25 metrics, the 25 most common metrics, according to cost, quality, productivity, agent metrics, service level metrics, and call handling metrics. Now, it's important to familiarize yourself with these metrics and know these metrics, but the bigger thing when it comes to key performance indicators is to understand the cause and effect relationship that they have to each other. If we start with the foundation metrics, the two metrics that are more meaningful than any other, cost per ticket is your measure of efficiency, customer satisfaction is your measure of effectiveness. But you can't deliberately You can't go out there and just cut your cost per ticket or increase your customer satisfaction, but what you can do is impact your agent utilization, which can drive down your cost per contact. You can impact your FCR, which can drive up your customer satisfaction. So if you understand these cause and effect relationships, and you know how these key performance indicators interact with each other and how they're interrelated with each other, this gives you a great deal of power, because then it puts in your hands the understanding of which levers you can pull to achieve desired outcomes. If you're trying to reduce your cost per ticket, you look first at agent utilization. You might also look at service levels, because they have an impact on agent utilization, which has an impact on cost per ticket. So when you put the cause and effect relationship together, what you end up with is a linkage of key performance indicators. And what you can see here is that virtually every key performance indicator in the service desk is impacted by and interconnected with every other key performance indicator in the service desk. And if you're trying to drive your customer satisfaction higher, you've got some leverage to do that through first contact resolution rate, call quality, and agent job satisfaction. Likewise, if you're trying to reduce your cost per ticket, you have some leverage to do that by maximizing your agent utilization and reducing your first level, or maximizing your first level resolution rate, which helps drive down your total cost of ownership. Now, let's look at the same two charts for desktop support. I've got 30 metrics shown on page 25, and once again, I'm only scratching the surface. There are literally hundreds more metrics, but we've organized these into 7 categories. We've got cost metrics, quality metrics, productivity metrics, service level metrics, technician metrics, workload metrics, and ticket handling metrics. I'm just going to check my audio here for a minute, because I've gotten a couple of text messages indicating that my audio is cutting in and out. So give me a moment here just to check my audio. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully all of you can hear me now. We've got 7 categories of metrics here, and again, we're only scratching the surface. There are hundreds more. Once again, what is important to understand on this page is the KPI relationships and linkages, and how each KPI is interconnected with and is either driven by or drives the other KPIs. Once again, we've got our foundation metrics, cost per ticket, customer satisfaction, driven respectively by technician utilization and FCR for incidents. Then we've got this third set of metrics, or tertiary metrics. Your service levels have a big impact on cost per ticket and desktop support. Service levels also impact customer satisfaction in desktop support. Mean time to resolve is a big driver of customer satisfaction. By contrast, for the service desk, your service levels don't have much of an impact at all on customer satisfaction. They are a big deal, though, when it comes to desktop support. So once again, if you understand the cause and effect relationships of the major key performance indicators for the service desk and for desktop support, you're in a very powerful position to pull the levers that you need to pull to achieve desired outcomes. If you understand how to drive customer satisfaction, you can focus on technician satisfaction and FCR for incidents and service level times, mean time to resolve, for both both incidents and service requests. If you're trying to drive your costs down, you can focus on service levels. If they're too aggressive, your costs will be high. If you back off on those service levels, oftentimes your costs will go down, but technician utilization is your biggest single driver of cost per ticket in the desktop environment. Now, what this organization decided to do to drive a more collaborative environment so that they could realize a larger percentage of their bonus every year was to create a scorecard that included their weighted average cost per ticket for both level 1 and service desk, the weighted average customer satisfaction for both the service desk and desktop support. Sorry, I misspoke here. I meant level 1 and desktop support. weighted average customer satisfaction for the service desk and desktop support. 2 TCO metrics, first level resolution rate for level 1 support, percent resolved level 1 capable for desktop support, and they rolled these into a balanced scorecard that was designed to get them working together more effectively so that they could realize a larger percentage of the bonus that was put on the table every year. So we have 2 cost metrics, one for the service desk, one for desktop support. 2 quality metrics, one for the service desk, one for desktop support, and 2 TCO metrics, level 1 resolution rate for the service desk, percent resolved level 1 capable for desktop support. Now those of you who've been on prior webcasts know that we use this scorecard a lot. We use it for the service desk by itself, we use it for desktop support by itself, and we even use these for individual agents. This scorecard can be repurposed for individual technicians working in desktop support or individual agents working in a service desk. Once you define these metrics, in this particular case, these are designed to create common goals and incentives for this support organization. Each metric is weighted according to its relative importance, and this represents MetricNet's judgment as to which metrics are the most important. It's your call as to what weights you put on these, but we overweight cost and quality because we believe that those are more important. Of course, these add to 100%. Then we put some typical ranges in here that you would expect to see in the industry. And the organization that's measuring this performance, these are actually hypothetical numbers. We weren't allowed to divulge the real numbers. They put their own performance in this third column from the right, and they calculate a metric score for each of these 6 metrics. Here's how they do that. They take the worst case scenario minus their actual performance. That becomes the numerator of your metric score. We divide that by the range, which is the worst case minus the best case. So this essentially is an interpolation formula that tells you how far along the path you've traveled from the worst case scenario to the best case scenario. A high number, as we've got down here for percent resolved level 1 capable, says that you're pretty close to the best case scenario at 8%. By contrast, a lower number, as we've got here for service desk cost per ticket, tells you that their $22 is actually closer to the worst case scenario than it is to the best case scenario. The final step in this process is to multiply the metric score by the metric weighting to come up with a balanced score for the metric, and when we add all those together, we come up with a single overall score that measures the effectiveness of IT service and support for the level 1 service desk and desktop support. Again, what this organization did is they put this scorecard in place as a way to monitor their own performance in an effort to capture a larger percentage of the bonus. Now, over time, what you want to be doing is updating your scorecard monthly or quarterly and tracking the results. Ideally, those numbers should be going up. The blue bars here represent the monthly score. The purple background represents the trailing 12-month average. You can also use this to benchmark against other organizations, which they did. Here's their score, 66.9%, which actually turns out to be a pretty good score. When you use the same algorithm for hundreds of IT service and support organizations worldwide, you find that the average score is only about 50%, and you have a nice bell-shaped curve centered right above 50%. So after implementing this scorecard, in an effort to create common goals and incentives with IT service and support to get the service desk and desktop support groups working more collaboratively to reduce cost, improve quality, and drive down total cost of ownership, over the course of 1 year, they saw significant reductions in cost. Cost per ticket went from $22 to $19 at level 1, from $64 to $62 at desktop support. Customer satisfaction for the service desk went from 85 to 92%. Desktop support customer satisfaction went from 90 to 93%. The level 1 resolution rate, which is the TCO metric for the service desk, went from 88% to 91%. So they're already doing a good job. I made that point early on, and what they were trying to do was get better so they could capture a larger percentage of the bonus that was on the table. Percent resolved level 1 capable went from 8% down to 4%. Their balance score at the beginning of this process was 67%. It went up to 76%, and they were able to capture an additional 21 percentage points on the bonus. Before they did this benchmark, or before they created the scorecard, they were able to capture 42% of the bonus money. When they were finished a year later, they were able to capture 64% of the bonus money. So this is just a tool that can be used by service and support to create a common set of goals and incentives to look at overall performance as opposed to siloed individual performance of the service desk or desktop support. And that brings us to our final polling questions of the day, and those polling questions have to do with benchmarking, and specifically, the next polling question is this. Have you benchmarked your support organization within the past year? You benchmarked your support organization within the past year. By the way, I want to thank everybody for participating in this webcast once again today. Got a lot of familiar names on the webcast, but we've also got some new people, and I want to welcome all of you. I'll just do a shout out here to a few people. Chuck Hill, thanks for coming. It's great. John Cole, great to see you here. Michael Cheney, good to have you here. Thanks for joining our webcast. Tatiana Steen, thanks for coming. Great to have you here. And Tom Beatty, thanks for coming. Okay, almost 90% of you have weighed in on this particular poll. Have you benchmarked your support organization within the past year? I'm going to share these results with you, and 28% of you have benchmarked within the past year. Another 59% of you have not benchmarked within the past year. 12% are not affiliated with a support organization, so presumably the question does not apply. So let me open up a corollary question, a follow-on question, if you will. Whoops. Follow-on question is this. Do you plan to benchmark your support organization in the future? Do you plan to benchmark your support organization in the future? Okay, weigh in on this if you would. Got 50% participation. We're up to 60%, 70%. Weigh in on this if you would. Do you plan to benchmark your support organization in the future? Okay, we've got almost 90% participation. Give you another few seconds here to weigh in on this poll, and then I'll share the results with you. Okay, let me go ahead and share these results. Okay, 11% of you are planning to benchmark within the next 90 days. 14% of you are planning to benchmark within the next 6 months. 28% say that you're planning to benchmark your service and support organization within the next year. And 32% don't have any plans to benchmark at this time. Now, that 32% is roughly equal to, on the prior poll, the percentage of those who have benchmarked in the last year. So I'm guessing that most who have no plans to benchmark in the next year probably overlaps quite a bit with those who have already done a benchmark in the past year. I know it's not completely coincident. It's not the Venn diagram. It's not a single circle. But there's probably a fair amount of overlap between those who have no plans to benchmark at this time and those who have benchmarked within the past year. Now, for those who are planning to benchmark within the next 3 to 6 months or 12 months, I want to encourage you to stick with those plans. And the reason is this. What we've seen in service and support is that there's a one-to-one correlation between those IT service and support organizations that benchmark and those that are world-class in their performance. Now, some IT service and support organizations are world-class because they benchmark. They got there by benchmarking. By contrast, some benchmark because they're already great. In other words, they managed through hook and crook, through trial and error, to improve their performance and become world-class, and then decided, well, benchmarking is a way to stay on top of this. Benchmarking is a way to ensure that we remain world-class. But benchmarking is a relatively straightforward process. Doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't cost a lot of money. It is the quickest, most efficient, most surefire way to improve your performance and to achieve world-class results in a limited period of time. It's not something that has to take you months and months, let alone years and years. You can get there in a matter of weeks through benchmarking. Again, the real power of benchmarking is that the industry best practices are well known and well understood. They're there for the taking. All you have to do is prioritize them, adopt and adapt them into your own organization to achieve world-class performance. That's the real value of benchmarking. So for those of you who are planning to do it within the next 90 days, 6 months, or 1 year, I want to encourage you once again, please stick with those plans because you'll find that this is probably one of the best investments of time and energy that you can make for your organization. Okay, I'm going to move on now to our final case study of the day. Let me make my screen bigger here. Our final case study of the day is a large telco, Fortune 100. You can probably guess who they are. And they were conducting monthly meetings with the service desk and desktop support to review tickets. Now, some people call this closed ticket analysis. Some people call it root cause analysis. It's the same thing. The whole idea is that by looking at tickets, you can make sure that you're categorizing them properly and also identifying those that can potentially be resolved through root cause analysis. Some RCA root cause analysis prescriptions involve better training of end users. Some of them involve more effective display on applications, for example. There's a lot of different ways that you can eliminate potential problems through root cause analysis or closed ticket analysis. Those organizations that practice this and are really good at it have been able to eliminate as much as 15% of their incoming call volume. And again, this is called level -1 support because this is the ticket that you never have because the user just doesn't have the problem. Either they're trained properly or you've eliminated that potential source of problem systematically. Now, benchmarks within this telco show that the first level resolution rate on the service desk was low, and at desktop support, benchmarks showed that nearly half the tickets resolved by desktop support could have been resolved at level 1. Think about that, 50% level 1 resolvable, percent resolved level 1 capable, nearly 50%. That's a big number. Now, what I want to do on the next 4 pages is share some industry data with you to give you a feel for what these metrics look like. And I'm back to this metric again, percent resolved, level 1 capable. This comes right out of our database. It's industry data, so it's a pretty good snapshot of what's going on in the industry. And once again, this is for desktop support, the percentage of tickets they resolved that could have and should have been resolved at level 1. You can see the number ranges from a low of 4% to a high of almost 40%. The average is over 18%. If we organize these, and by the way, we show percent resolved level 1 capable along the x-axis, number of data points on the y-axis, so we get a histogram by doing this. The first quartile is at 12.7%, and what that says is that if your percent resolved level 1 capable for tickets and desktop support is less than 12.7%, you're in the first quartile. If you're between 12.7 and 18.1%, you're in the second quartile. Median means half the data is above and half is below. It's a different statistic than the mean or the average. The third quartile is between 18.1% and 24.3%. And finally, you're going to be in the bottom quartile if more than 24% of the tickets resolved by desktop support could and should have been resolved at level 1. So that's the first piece of data that I want to show you, and then I'm going to tie all these together at the end of this case study. Second piece of data I want to show you is for level 1 resolution, sometimes called FLR, or first level resolution rate, which with this same data set, as I showed on the prior page, the average for the industry is about 74%. That's what this vertical dashed line here, orange line. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. That's what that represents. The maximum level 1 resolution rate is almost 99%. The minimum is 24%. And to a question that was asked earlier in this broadcast, we're talking about net FLR, meaning resolved at level 1 divided by any ticket that can potentially be resolved at level 1. So if you've got a hardware break fix, it doesn't count against you. You can't resolve that at level 1. The median here, meaning half above, half below, is 75%. But look at this. To get to an FLR of more than 95%, only 2% of IT services support organizations have been able to do that. It's a difficult thing to do. We recognize that. Now, these two metrics are related, but you can't simply take 1 minus this, 1 minus 73.9, to get to the percent resolved level 1 capable. And the reason is that you handle a different volume of tickets at level 1 than you do in desktop support. So you don't find that this metric, that is FLR, is the complement of this metric because you have different denominators, different ticket volumes at level 1 and at desktop support. But this is the histogram once again for level 1 resolution rate, first level resolution rate. We show the net FLR on the x-axis, and then we show the number of data records on the y-axis. So this gives you a pretty good feel for what the industry looks like when it comes to level 1 resolution rate. Now remember the problems that this organization was experiencing. Low first level resolution rate, and nearly half the tickets resolved by desktop support were resolvable at level 1. So they looked at a number of possible solutions for improving their FLR and reducing their percent resolved level 1 capable. And specifically, they looked at process as well as technology. And on the technology side, they asked us to provide them with data that would help them make a decision on adopting a remote diagnostic tool. Now, most of you probably use remote diagnostic tools. These would include, and we're not endorsing anybody, we remain vendor neutral, but these include tools like GoToAssist, LogMeIn, BombGuard, and others. They're tools that can be used both at level 1 and by desktop support to proxy into a user's computer remotely, see what they see, take over their screen, do some troubleshooting remotely. Now the blue diamonds here represent first level resolution rate for those IT service and support organizations that have remote diagnostic software. The fuchsia squares represent the first level resolution rate for those IT service and support organizations that do not use remote diagnostic software. You can see that with remote diagnostic software, the FLR averages about 78%, whereas for those service and support organizations that do not have one of these tools, their first level resolution rate is only about 61%. So our conclusion when we were asked to advise this company on whether or not this would help them, the answer is yes. That doesn't necessarily mean you invest in it. You've got to do a business case analysis. You've got to look at the upfront cost. You've got to look at the customizing cost, if anything. You've got to look at the long-term care and feeding of the technology. Technology is generally cheap. What's expensive is the implementation and customization and the long-term care and feeding of that technology. That's why every year when we run a survey on knowledge management, almost all our clients say, yeah, of course we have knowledge management, but the next question is, well, do you have a significant body of knowledge in your knowledge base? Only about 20% of them actually have a significant amount of knowledge in their knowledge base, and that's because it's cheap to buy a knowledge management system. It's very expensive to populate it and maintain it over time. But the conclusion here was unmistakable. Remote diagnostic software does facilitate higher first level and first contact resolution rates. Now, the point I made about knowledge management a moment ago kind of plays in on slide 38 here, where we're looking at the effect of knowledge-based maturity on first level resolution rate. Now, we have a proprietary scale that we use when we look at K-based maturity, scale of 1 to 5. 1 essentially says, yeah, we've got some knowledge, but there aren't a whole lot of articles in there. 2 says we're, trying to improve. 3 says we're proficient but not great. 4 says we're getting there. We're, getting pretty good at this. And 5 says you've got a very mature knowledge management system where 90+% of the solutions can be found in the knowledge base. Now, the blue diamonds again here represent data points. The red line represents a linear regression through the data. And when the K-based maturity is level 1, you can see that your net first level resolution rate is significantly lower than if your maturity is 2, 3, 4, or 5, which is another way of saying that as your knowledge base matures, as you get more solutions in there and you're maintaining it more effectively, you can expect to see an improvement and an increase in both your first level resolution rate and your first contact resolution rate. Now, here's what the company did. Based on this data, they said, okay, we're going to adopt this remote diagnostic tool because we don't have one now. We're going to do some simple stuff, and this is really simple. We're going to put a checkbox on the desktop support ticket so that when it gets closed out by desktop support, if necessary, they'll check this box. It says, resolved but level 1 capable. That's one of the easiest ways to start tracking that metric, and then you audit it periodically. Typically once a month is what organizations do. They'll go through those tickets that were marked level 1 resolvable and make a determination as to whether or not that was an accurate determination. And so you want to trust but verify, meaning that you need that checkbox, but periodically you need an audit to make sure that tickets that are being designated as level 1 resolvable truly are, and tickets that are not being designated as level 1 resolvable truly had to be resolved by desktop support. That's an issue as well. There's almost a built-in conflict of interest here because desktop support would, well, frankly, they don't mind getting some of the tickets that they get from level 1 support, particularly if it's a relatively easy ticket. They'd like to keep those. And so in some cases, there might be a conflict of interest that says, well, we're not going to designate this as level 1 resolvable because we like getting these kinds of tickets. Now, I'm not casting aspersions, but I'm saying it does happen in the industry. So the audit works both ways. You're looking both for tickets marked level 1 capable that were in fact not level 1 capable, and you're looking for tickets that were not marked level 1 capable that were in fact level 1 capable. They established a goal for first level resolution and a goal for percent resolved level 1 capable, and they put in place a strict SPOC model. Here's what happened. Before they implemented this action plan, their first level resolution rate was 61%. 6 months later, it was 83%. Percent resolved level 1 capable was 44%. They got it down to 17%, and the weighted average cost per ticket dropped from $96 to $61. Significant savings. Why? Because if you're pushing tickets back to level 1, it's much less expensive to resolve at level 1 than it is at desktop support. Now, what I want to do is share some thoughts with you on what I call the paradox of IT service and support. And this will hopefully pull together the key insights from these case studies and put an explanation point on the importance of IT service and support. Now, I realize to a certain extent I'm preaching to the choir because most of you are IT service and support professionals. But for those of you who work in IT but not in IT service and support, this is a particularly germane message. The paradox is this. Less than 5% of all IT resources are spent on end user support. and that includes service desk, desktop support, and field support. The vast majority of IT spending is for other areas like apps development, application maintenance, network operations, mainframe and mid-range computing, desktop computing, and services like disaster recovery. Now, unfortunately, because a relatively small slice of the pie is allocated to end-user support, a lot of people assume that there's really no upside in IT support. And we've even had clients, believe it or not, tell us that the service desk or desktop support or IT support in general is a necessary evil. It's a keep the lights on function. We need it. We wish we didn't have to have it, but we need it. That reflects their belief that there's really no upside. There's really no economic value being added. And again, I want to point out that for those of you who are in Las Vegas next week for the HDI Conference, I'll be speaking on this very issue, the economic impact of IT service and support. I think the people that attend that session will be hopefully pleasantly surprised and in some cases shocked about the value produced by IT service and support. And I'm going to preview some of those results with you momentarily. The result is that most organizations are managed IT service and support, that is, managed with the goal of minimizing costs. But the most effective service and support strategies focus on maximizing value. And this is why, particularly if you're on this call, I know we've got several tens of CIOs on the call, a lot of CTOs on the call. The place to focus your time and energy, in my opinion, is on IT service and support. This is a high leverage activity because it drives customer satisfaction for all of IT. It doesn't just drive satisfaction for service and support, it drives satisfaction for all of IT. What you're seeing here on page 43 is a survey that we conducted over a year ago. Over 1,000 large organizations, global large cap companies. We surveyed end users in these companies and we asked them, to tell us what drives your opinion about corporate IT. We didn't ask them about support. We said corporate IT. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Something in between? And what are the factors that drive your opinion? 84%, and this was the conclusion that we found most stunning, said that the service desk is what drives my view of IT. They didn't say this drives their view of service and support. They say this is what drives my view of IT. The second most common response was desktop support. This is what drives my view of IT. And this makes sense because this is where end users have their most common interaction with IT. They don't hang out in the data center. They don't go to the NOC. They tend not to hang out with the application development and maintenance people, but they do have periodic interactions with the service desk and with desktop support. And by the way, these numbers add up to more than 100% because on each survey, the survey recipient was allowed to answer 3 times, that is, provide 3 responses per survey. Now, this is a profound conclusion. Less than 5% of IT dollars are spent on support, but the vast majority of end-user opinion about IT service and support is driven by interactions with the service desk and with desktop support. Now, if I'm a leader within IT, a manager, a director, a CIO, or a CTO, the message here is crystal clear to me. I'm going to invest whatever I need to, whatever dollars, technology, and my personal time is necessary to ensure that service and support is the best that it can possibly be. Because if they're outstanding, all of IT looks good. And if all of IT looks good, I, Mr. or Ms. CIO or CTO or director or manager, also look good. So if you want to know where there's high leverage in the IT support function, it is in service and support. Because this is where you get the greatest leverage in terms of driving customer satisfaction. It is also a huge source of leverage for returning productivity to end users. Let me explain what I've got here on page 44. We're looking at productive hours lost per employee per year. Now, most users, or most knowledge users have, as I mentioned very early on, multiple devices. The average now is more than 3, between smartphones, desktop computers, laptop computers, and other devices. And any problems that these knowledge workers, and by the way, the majority of workers in North America are now in fact knowledge workers. They're not manufacturing workers. They're not agricultural workers. They're knowledge workers. And anything that impedes their productivity, a software outage, a network that goes down, a hardware break fix, a move ad change, anything like that hurts their productivity. And what we've shown is that across North America, the average knowledge worker loses about 34 productive hours per year due to various IT device and service outages, interruptions, and so on. However, and this is the kind of the punchline, if we organize those service and support organizations into quartiles based upon their customer satisfaction first contact resolution rate and mean time to resolve for the service desk. Same metrics for desktop support, customer satisfaction, FCR for incidents, mean time to resolve on tickets. If we organize these support organizations into quartiles, the best performing quartile, the second best performing quartile, the third quartile, and the bottom quartile, here's what we found, is that in those companies that have a top quartile IT service and support organization, the average user loses about 17 productive hours a year. That's not insignificant. It's more than 2 days. But compare that to the fourth quartile service and support organizations who lose 47 hours of productive time a year. They lose more than a full week every year. They're losing 6 full productive days a year. This is critically important to understand. IT service and support is not a nice to have. It's not a keep the lights on function. It's not a necessary evil. It is a function that drives the overall view of IT, of information technology within the enterprise, and has the power to return productive hours to end users. So if you look at the productive hours lost per employee per year, once again, the blue diamonds are data points. The red line is a linear regression through the data. If you're a top quartile producing IT service and support organization, your end users are losing about 17 productive hours a year. If you're a second quartile organization, your end users lose about 26 productive hours a year through various IT outages, network outages, software problems, and so on. If you're a third quartile service and support organization, your users lose about 37 hours a year. And again, if you're in the bottom quartile on service and support, your average knowledge worker, end user, is losing about 47 productive hours a year. Look at the stunning difference between a top quartile performing support organization and a bottom quartile supporting organization. The difference is about 30 hours per year. Now multiply that across the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of end users within your organization, and you're looking at real dollars. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, that you've got 10,000 people within your organization. If you're saving each of those 10,000 people 30 hours per year, you're saving 30,000 productive hours per year. We know that there is about 2,000 productive hours per year. I've got my math wrong. 10,000 end users, 30 hours per year. So we're looking at 300,000 productive hours per year, which translates into about 150 FTEs. So in that 10,000 person organization, a top quartile producing or top quartile IT service and support organization saves the equivalent of about 150 FTEs per year. That's a huge number. That's real productivity returned to the end users. That is the second source of value you need to understand in a top-performing service and support organization. The first one being your ability to influence end users' view of all of IT. And your third source of leverage we've been talking about all day, which is total cost of ownership. Getting it done at level 1 enables you to minimize your total cost of support. So if you understand the economics of IT service and support, and you can drive the tickets down to the lowest level possible. Sometimes that's desktop support, sometimes it's level 1, sometimes it's level 3, or field support, or even vendor support. But getting it done as low in this hierarchy as you possibly can helps save dollars for the organization. And that is the paradox of IT service and support. Less than 5% of all IT spending allocated to end user support, but huge leverage to drive a positive view of IT, to return productive hours to the end users, and to minimize total cost of ownership. So why collaborate? Well, there are barriers. You will experience those barriers. Are they worth overcoming? Absolutely. As I've demonstrated, you'll see reduced support costs, higher customer satisfaction, shorter cycle times on resolution, enhanced end user productivity, and greater customer satisfaction for all of IT. So let me close by suggesting that there are at least 5 things that you can do moving forward almost immediately to leverage some of the insights that you may have gained here today. Once again, I want to encourage all of you to connect with MetricNet on social media, where we put out a steady stream of information that support professionals may find useful. We have 4 LinkedIn groups as well as a LinkedIn company page. We also have 4 Google Plus communities and a Google company page. We're active on Facebook and Twitter, and we have a MetricNet YouTube channel. In the copy of the presentation itself, we have provided links to all of our social media pages and groups. And again, if you fill out the survey at the conclusion of the webcast, we'll go ahead and send you a copy of today's presentation. And for those who are attending the HDI Conference in Las Vegas next month, HDI has designated MetricNet for the opening presentation of the conference. This is session 101. This presentation will address the economic impact of support and how you can create a value proposition for your support organization. The second presentation is all about key performance indicators for desktop support and how you can use desktop support KPIs diagnostically and holistically. I'd ask you to look us up if you're at the conference, and if you're interested, please attend our presentations. Don't forget to register for our upcoming webcasts. These are always free of charge. Our next 3 webcasts are on key performance indicators. May 7th, we're looking at service desk key performance indicators. June 11th, desktop support key performance indicators. And on July 9th, we're looking at call center key performance indicators. So I'd encourage you to sign up if you're interested, particularly in key performance indicators for service and support or your call center. Also, feel free to browse through our resource library on MetricNet's website, where you'll find a number of white papers, presentations, podcasts, and magazine articles on benchmarking and industry best practices. And for those who are serious about becoming world-class and want to get there quickly, MetricNet's IT service and support benchmarks are probably the quickest and easiest way to get there. These benchmarks are built on MetricNet's worldwide database of IT service and support indicators. And they include more than 25 KPIs. They include a balanced scorecard, a roadmap to achieve world-class performance that is very specific and unique to your IT service and support organization. You can reach MetricNet at this phone number in the United States, 703-992-7559, or on our website. We have Contact Us forms, or you can email us at info@metricnet.com. Now, for those who have time to stay on for a few more minutes, I'll be answering any questions that you typed in during the webcast that I did not get to during the first Q&A break. And for those who must exit the webcast at this time, I want to thank you for attending this session. I hope you found it to be informative and insightful. Please remember to complete the brief survey that pops up when you exit the webcast. This is a requirement if you wish to receive a copy of today's presentation. So thank you once again. Let me take a look at the questions that we've got in queue. Okay. Let's see if I can find where I left off. Okay, from Wayne, is there an opportunity to listen to this presentation at a later time? I missed the whole thing with audio issues. I apologize about the audio issues, but yes, we are going to be sending out, for anybody who completes a survey at the end of the webcast, we'll be sending out a link to the webcast recording. So if you'd like to listen to it again, you can. Hopefully the audio will be better on the recording than it was on the live presentation. From Patricia, if your level 1 support desk is in a different state than your level 2 support, should this be a big concern? Not necessarily. It does mean that you're not going to have cross-trained agents that do both level 1 and level 2 support, but if you're in different physical locations, that, in my opinion, shouldn't make that big a difference, as long as you set up communication channels and processes and procedures that enable you to interact effectively with each other. So I don't see that as a big concern. I don't see it as a huge barrier, but you do have to make a special effort to ensure that the communications are effective, that you agree upon the rules of engagement, that the handoffs are well understood, that you've got operating level agreements. You should be doing, frequent meetings with each other, through a web video service like WebEx or GoToMeeting or similar services. So you've got to make a special effort to communicate effectively, but I would not be overly concerned about being in different physical locations. We've seen many world-class service and support organizations that did operate geographically in geographically different regions, and they were still very successful. From Gene, I have seen FTEs that serve both functions. Does it make sense to separate them out, or is our number small enough that it wouldn't be as efficient? Well, I don't know what your number is, Gene, so I don't know if it makes sense to separate them out. But the rules that I gave, or the guidelines, if you will, the heuristics on when it makes sense to have cross-trained service desk and desktop support agents are when you're in a relatively high-density environment so that you're co-located with your users, and also that your scale is relatively low, meaning that you have fewer than 20 total support personnel. Okay, from Ed, how do companies handle the difference in pay and official duties when transitioning to universal agents? Ed, usually what happens when an agent becomes a universal agent, that is, becomes cross-trained in both level 1 and desktop support, they usually get a bump in pay. And that pay is usually whatever a desktop support tech would make plus a little bit beyond that. Of the 3 categories, service desk technician, desktop support technician, and a cross-trained technician, generally there's about a 10 to 20% differential between desktop support professionals and level 1 professionals, meaning the desktop support professionals tend to make a little bit more. And then if you get a cross-trained person, they tend to make about 5 to 10% more than a desktop support professional. So the cross-trained technicians are the ones that tend to make the most. Then your desktop support technicians tend to make 10 to 20% more than your level 1. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm saying that's what the industry data tells us. So in terms of official duties and compensation, that's what we tend to see in the industry. From Andrea, how resolvable tickets can be easily tracked. I'm not sure what the question means. I think it's a follow-on to your last question, Andrea. So let me see if I can get back to that. From Patricia, should metrics be tracked on the use of knowledge base articles produced and utilized by both level 1 and level 2 support? Yes, I believe they should be, because you need to know if your knowledge base is being used effectively, and you also need to know if the knowledge base itself is effective, whether or not the knowledge base is providing useful information for desktop techs as well as level 1 techs to resolve and increase both the FCR and the FLR. Now from Michael, question is, when we discuss driving costs down, how would you explain to an organization this concept when the dollar saved isn't actually funds that I can give them back? In other words, even when we define driving costs down, most organizations I work with want to see the actual money. Yeah, I think the premise of your question is incorrect. When you say that the dollars saved you can't give back, that's not true. Because if you're talking about making service and support more efficient, you're talking about resolving more at level 1, which means resolving less at desktop support. I hate to be so blunt about it, but there are headcount issues associated with that. When an IT service and support organization rationalizes and becomes more efficient, you will see a shedding of headcount. Nobody likes to talk about it, but that's the case. This is a labor-intensive function. And any serious effort to reduce costs and make these functions more efficient typically does involve some right-sizing, famous euphemism, but that's the reality, is that if you're saving money in IT service and support, it's not funds that just disappear. You will actually have dollar savings, and those dollar savings are generally the result of lower headcount that comes about when you're operating a more efficient service and support function. We showed that in one of the case studies, the cross-training case study, where they went from 19 FTEs down to 17 FTEs through cross-training. Now, the good news, if you could call it that, is that IT service and support is a high turnover function. So generally, if you're trying to reduce headcount and hence cost, you don't have to fire anybody. Generally, turnover will take care of it. In other words, you can downsize, usually pretty effectively, just through attrition and not replacing those people. So as far as driving costs down, there's no need to explain that money is not being saved, because funds are being saved, and it should show up in savings to the organization. Okay, question here from Burke. It's a partial question. They were promoted from the desk and can always be used as Tier 1 calls in a pinch, just in timers. Okay, so I think that comes from an earlier question that Burke had, having these cross-trained people used for Tier 1 in a pinch, what Burke is calling just-in-timers. Yeah, we've seen variations on this cross-training theme, where the vast majority of a tech's time might be spent on desktop support, but when the calls become overwhelming, or there's a call spike, or there's a new rollout that drives additional volume at level 1, you can temporarily transfer those agents over to the level 1 service desk. Okay, question from Ben. How can we encourage Tier 2 and 3 support to let go of some of their duties and let service desk handle them? I often see them being reluctant to do so. Well, assuming that level 1 can handle the things that they're doing, you should be doing those things. And if there are political or organizational barriers to making that happen, I think you need to escalate that issue to someone who has the power to look at it objectively and say, wait a second, if Tier 2 and 3 are doing things that level 1 can do, And we oftentimes hear the argument, oh, we can't, the level 1 can't be trusted with this stuff because they're going to get in there and mess everything up, so we're not going to give them access rights. To be blunt, that's a bogus argument. I've never once seen level 1 or desktop support get into a system and mess something up. This is a turf protection issue, it's a political issue, and it's a nonsense issue, to be honest with you. So the short answer, Ben, is that you need friends in high places. You need to escalate this issue to somebody who has the authority and the ability to make a change. And if you've got tiers 2 and 3 holding on to some areas of support that should be done at level 1 or at desktop support, then the process needs to be changed. More often than not, we find that just the opposite is true, where tier 2 and 3 just don't want anything to do with support. And so you escalate tickets to them or send them tickets, and they sit on them for a while because you don't have an operating level agreement or because they're just not enthusiastic about it. That's the more common problem. But what you're describing, Ben, is still an issue. And my suggestion is you need to escalate that to somebody who has the power and the authority to, by fiat if necessary, make a change. Okay, next question is from Andre. Could you please return to the comparison table to represent Spock implementation and comment on the figures once again, and especially the last line? I'm not sure which table that was, the Spock implementation. If you could let me know what that last line was, because we talked about Spock so much in this presentation, I'm not sure which page you're talking about, but if you can be more specific about the page, I'll go back to it. Okay, from Jamie. I just joined the webinar. Will I be able to get a copy of the presentation? The answer is yes. Just fill out the survey. Okay. In our organization, desktop support is defined as members of the service desk we send when needed to do desk side support. How is desktop support defined in your statistics? It seems you may be including computer operations, but I'm unclear on that. And this is from Robert. No, desktop support is literally when you go to the desk side of a user or a device. It can be just a device like a server, for example, or a rack full of servers or telecommunications equipment. When you go to the site of the issue, the incident, or the service request, or the problem, and you resolve it on site. It's a hands-on resolution. If your agents are cross-trained and they do both that desk side or hands-on support as well as the remote phone support and email support, that's fine. I don't think that changes the definition of desktop support versus level 1 support. But when you say I'm including computer operations, no, I'm not including computer operations at all. I'm not including data center stuff, not including NOC stuff or anything like that. When I talk about support, I'm talking about end user and device service requests, incidents, problems, issues, how-to questions, and the like that can be resolved either remotely over the phone by a level 1 technician or on-site by a desk side or desktop support technician. Next question is from Michael. How do you define FCR for the desktop? It only applies, Michael, to incidents, not to service requests. So if it's an incident and you resolve it on your first visit to the site of the user or the site of the device, it counts as FCR for that incident. And then it says if a tech needs to go get a part or is otherwise interrupted and needs to reconnect, is that still tracked as FCR? If the technician needs a part or somehow interrupted, well, that ticket's not resolved on first contact. And that's just the reality of it. There are some desk side visits that can be resolved on first contact and some that cannot be resolved on first contact. But again, we apply it only to incidents, not to service requests. And what you're talking about, typically if you're talking about parts or a move, add, change, those are service requests as opposed to incidents. So that answers part of your question. But if it's a situation where it is an incident and it can't be resolved on the first contact with the device or the user, it's not going to count towards FCR for that incident. From Maria, are benchmarkings conducted remotely or does it need to be on site? How much time will we need for the entire process? Yeah, benchmarks absolutely can be conducted remotely. In fact, the vast majority of benchmarks MetricNet does are conducted remotely. Depending upon what level of detail you need in your benchmark, they can be turned around. I mean, you can purchase benchmarks right off our website if you go to our shopping page. For those that want something a little bit more consultative in nature, a benchmark can be done relatively quickly in a matter of days, depending upon how quickly you can get the information to the organization that's doing the benchmark. So the short answer is there are instantly downloadable benchmarks available on MetricNet's website, but if you want something more consultative in nature, a deeper dive, if you will, on your service desk or desktop support function, you're looking at least several days, sometimes a little bit longer than that. But even then, they can be conducted remotely. It doesn't require a busload of consultants coming on site. Okay. From Juan, want to know how to benchmark since applying the knowledge of your, don't understand that, didn't find a lot of organizations with the same consideration. I only find 7 worldwide. I think the best way to handle that, Juan, would be to go to our website, go to the shopping page, and see if we have a benchmark there that fits your unique situation. And if not, contact MetricNet, and we can tell you what it would take to benchmark your organization. From Beth, we want to implement a better ticketing system that would include a self-service portal, knowledge base, et cetera. But because we are an expense, we have to justify 3x the amount of soft costs that the ticketing system is costing yearly against the hard cost of the system. Is this a realistic request? So I assume that, let's see, 3x, you have to return 3 times the investment in the first year. I think that's what you're saying. So if you spend, say, $50,000 on your ticketing system, you need to get a return in the first year of $150,000. A 3x hurdle rate in year 1 is pretty high. I'll say that. It's not extremely unusual, but it is pretty high. Keep in mind, these are recurring savings. So if you get a ticketing system that yields a lower handle time and a higher self-service rate, you are going to be reducing your costs. But to get 3x the investment in the first year, that is a little bit steep. I think what your organization needs to recognize is that if there is a return, it's going to be a return that recurs year after year after year. But 3x is a little bit steep. I understand different organizations have different policies. Typically, it's more than 1x. In other words, if you're going to spend $10,000, they want to see at least a $10,000 return. It's typically less than 5x, but even 3x is on the steep side in terms of the return that they are expecting. Doesn't mean that it's the wrong number. It just means that it is on the high side. Okay, from Miriam, what aspects do you suggest to rate technician satisfaction? Technician satisfaction should be measured because it has a secondary impact on almost every other metric in IT service and support. Generally, you want to survey them at least once a year. If possible, survey them twice a year. Real short survey. You can set it up on a tool like SurveyMonkey, but you want to ask about training, i.e., do you get adequate training? You want to ask about coaching. Do you get adequate coaching? You want to ask about the career path. Do you feel like there's a reasonable career path for you? Usually only 4 or 5 questions. The last question is always, overall, how would you rank your satisfaction with your position here? Scale of 1 to 5. 5 says, I love it. It's best job ever. 1 says, I'm ready to pack up and go tomorrow. So these are relatively straightforward surveys, pretty simple. They don't take a lot of time to create, administer, or conduct. So it doesn't take your technicians off the phones or out of desktop support for more than about 15 or 20 minutes. You do need to leave a section for comments on the survey, so you don't just want them listing 1 through 5. You want to give them an opportunity to comment, if you will. Say, well, I'd like to see this improved, or I like this, or give them that open space to sort of tell you what's on their mind. But it's a relatively straightforward process. I'm glad you asked that question. From Kevin, have you seen a clearer defined leader in incident ticket tracking, for example, Altiris? Well, we know who the market share leader is, but in terms of who the leader is for any given environment, I don't want to. I don't know. I mean, I would have to know what your unique situation is before I could say who the leader is, because in some environments one tool may make sense. In a different environment, that tool may not make sense, and we don't get into brand names here, so I can't recommend one tool over another. So again, we know who the market share leader is, and we know who the market share leaders and the innovators are, but we don't recommend any particular vendor over another. It really depends upon the situation that you're in. If you're handling, say, 1,000 contacts per month, the solution is going to be very different than if you're handling 100,000 contacts per month. And there are a whole lot of factors like that that go into a decision on which tool to adopt. Okay, from Antonio, where can I find recommendations about remote diagnostic software and its functional, the implementation plus the remote control software? I would just Google, remote diagnostic software. A whole bunch of stuff's going to come up if you do that. I mentioned who some of the big vendors are in this space. You've heard of them before, I'm sure. Vendors like GoToAssist, vendors like Bomgar, vendors like LogMeIn. And there are quite a few others. Don't mean to diss anybody, but there are lots of vendors out there, and there's lots of reviews out there. There's a whole lot of good information out there that you can use to make a decision if you're considering, adopting a remote control tool. From John, do you have a tool to map out resource capabilities? I'm not sure what you mean by resource capabilities. So if you want to elaborate on that question, that might be helpful. I assume you're talking about the agents or the technicians. Again, we don't recommend brand names, but if you could clarify the question, I'll try and answer it. From Jaziri, good point about organizational and political barriers. Thank you. Okay, let's see. From Kevin, does MetricNet have a sample copy or guide to creating an OLA? Yes, we do. I'd just ask you to send us an email after the call. From Joseph, do you have resources on how to perform service desk assessment and user support assessment, how to develop service desk profile and cost? Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on what you mean by resources. If you go to our website, you'll see that we've got a resource library with a lot of white papers on it, Joseph, that might answer the questions that you're asking. We've got white papers on how to do benchmarking. We've got white papers on, desktop support KPIs, service desk KPIs. We've got the white papers on first contact resolution rate, first level resolution rate. So you may find what you need on our website if you go to the resource library. Okay. From John Merchant, shrinkage, hours needed by hours resources provide minus all the things like training, vacation. So how many hours it takes to do the work against how many hours you can really get out of an employee or team. Hey, John, there's the number that we use for available work hours. It's actually, we use available work minutes. And we measure all support organizations worldwide the same way. It's about 9,600 minutes per month. And that comes from 7.5 hours per shift times 21.5 work days per month times 60 minutes in an hour. You end up with about 9,600. So in a given month, there's about 9,600 work minutes. Now, that you take away from that, or I should say, that does not those 9,600 minutes are an ideal month. It doesn't take into account sick time, vacation time, holidays, break time, administrative time, or anything like that. It's just 9,600 available minutes per month. Now, when we look at productivity, when we're looking at agent productivity at level 1 or technician productivity at desktop support, we look at the ticket handle time multiplied by the number of tickets handled by the average agent. We divide it by those 9,600 minutes. For the service desk, the average utilization, which is the formula I just defined, is only about 50%, which says that of all the available minutes each month, the service desk technicians are only working about 50% of the time. It doesn't mean they're lazy. It doesn't mean they're slacking off. It simply means that when you take out all the things I just mentioned, like sick time, vacation time, holidays, break time, training time, and all of that kind of stuff, they end up being only about 50% productive. So worldwide, the average level 1 service desk tech utilization is only about 50%. And again, you can find a white paper on our website about this. Now, for desktop support, the number is a little bit higher. If you look at work time divided by total available time, the number is closer to 60%. There are a lot of reasons for that, but the main reason is that work gets queued up more efficiently in a desktop support environment, and so you can keep your desktop support sort of busy more easily than you can keep a service desk technician busy. In other words, the requests may come in according to an Erlang distribution for desktop support, but they tend to queue up and then be worked on usually on a FIFO first in, first out basis. Sometimes they're based on priority and severity, but you get a more even workflow in desktop support, and hence you get greater productivity out of your desktop support technicians. By contrast, when you've got live calls coming in as well as emails, and again, it's Erlang distributed, it's harder to smooth out that workflow. The calls don't queue up. People don't wait for 2 hours online. They abandon the call after a couple minutes. So you end up getting better productivity out of desktop support technicians than you do out of level 1 technicians just because of the workflow. And again, we define that as minutes worked in a month divided by minutes available in a month. I hope that answered your question. Okay. From Jaziri, How do we handle when customers flat out don't want to call level 1? Some customers just want to bypass level 1 altogether. Jazira, you're going to have some of that in every organization. You're always going to have diehards who say, I'm not going to call level 1, I don't like them, or I've got my favorite tech down the hall, I'm going to call that technician. Unfortunately, you can't eliminate it in its entirety. However, what all of the desktop techs need to be trained to do, if you're running a true SPOC organization, they need to be trained to say no. And it's a hard thing to do. If you've been providing service and support for somebody for a long time and suddenly that person says, hey, can you help me do this? To say, no, I'm sorry, you got to call level 1, and they will create a ticket and dispatch me if they need to. It's a hard thing to do. I realize that, but it's also the right thing to do. Even then, you're still going to have some people that refuse to follow the SPOC model. That's just the nature of life. Even in an organization that has a really good SPOC process, only about 90% of the people and users will follow the SPOC model. You'll still get 10% that try and bypass the model. But in order to make SPOC work, as I mentioned, your desktop techs have to be tough, and they've got to be able to say no when they are asked to provide on-the-spot service. You know, the alternative, you know, they offer an alternative, which is call level 1. If necessary, they will dispatch me, and I'll even stand here if you want me to while you call them. And if they believe that it needs to be dispatched to me, I'll give you support right here. So you can ease that transition, but you're always going to have some diehard users who simply refuse to call level 1. That's just the nature of this industry. From Robert, are you sending the survey via email? I have to go and want to copy the presentation. Short answer is when you log out of GoToWebinar, the presentation, or excuse me, the survey should pop up. So fill that out if you would, and then we'll make sure you get a copy of the presentation. From Jaziri again, some customers just flat out, well, I just answered that question. So let's see. Any suggestions on dealing with customers who flat out refuse to call level 1? I know I cannot be the only person who has seen this. Any advice? You know, if they flat out refuse to call level 1, you know, at some point they will be forced to call level 1 if you're enforcing the SPOC process. If you are in fact saying, no, we just can't assist you. Now, there's still bypass that can happen. They don't necessarily have to call desktop support. They might call their favorite tech in the data center, or someone that works in the applications group, or somebody who works in the NOC. Unfortunately, this leakage, this bypass, if you will, can't be prevented in its entirety. You simply have to recognize that it exists, do the best you can to enforce the SPOC model, and recognize that some of that bypass is going to occur. Okay, that was the last question. I want to give you another minute here in case you have any final questions. Please type those in, and I'll see if I can address them. And again, when you log out or when you go out of the GoToWebinar, a survey should pop up. Just complete that, and we'll go ahead and send you a copy of today's presentation. Okay, it doesn't look like there are any further questions. So I just want to thank all of you. We still got quite a few people on the call. I want to thank all of you for participating in this webcast today. I know that all of you are very busy, and the fact that you took time out of your busy schedules to hear MetricNet's webcast really means a lot to me. I genuinely appreciate it. So I hope you did find it to be informative and insightful. And again, fill out the survey, and I'll send you a copy of today's presentation. So thank you very much. Hope to see you on our next webcast. Goodbye now.